The great man theory of history that Napoleon changes the world, whereas versus the idea that Napoleon is a product of the French Revolution, as it were, is one way of thinking about this. That actually, if Thomas Edison had been run over by a tram before he'd invented the light bulb, we would still have light bulbs. There were so many other people coming up with the idea. If Sergey Brin had never met Larry Page, we wouldn't call it Google, but we would still have search engines. Sure. And whoever got the most successful search engine would still be a billionaire. And so, if you look at the computer industry over the last 50 years, this industry has an extraordinary inevitability about it, which is expressed in Moore's law, this marching forward of the efficiency and the cost of computers. And yet it produces these billionaires who make huge fortunes out of doing these inevitable things that were going to be done anyway, which I find an interesting paradox to think about. So to some extent, we are making the mistake of giving too much credit and too much reward to individuals. And we're singling people out from teams and mixtures of people. I mean, I have a section in the book called Who Invented the Computer? And I draw very heavily on Walter Isaacson's wonderful book, The Innovators, to understand that story. And in the end, I conclude that even though this happened only a couple of generations ago and everything was written down and everybody knew what everybody was doing, so it's not one of these things that's lost in the mists of time in the early 18th century like the steam engine, we can't say who invented the computer. There is no answer to that question. The first computer, if it was the ENIAC in Philadelphia, well, the ENIAC didn't have stored programs. Well, if it was the Mark I in Harvard, well, that didn't have electronics. It was a mechanical device, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how it's a much more collective, a much more distributed phenomenon, innovation, than we generally give it credit for.
Yeah, we like romance. And I think the picking of the great inventor, the great mind, the great whatever appeals to our sense of romance there. I'm not quite sure why.
I should just add that the first half of my book is stories about people. And I single out these people and I tell their stories. But I do so partly in order to say that although these people achieved incredible things, they invented the steam engine or vaccines or whatever it might be, they did so as part of a process and part of a team and part of a group. They weren't gods. And I think this is quite an important lesson to teach young people, particularly today, because there's a tendency to say, Marconi or Morse or Watt or someone like that was unbelievably brilliant, or even Steve Jobs was unbelievably clever and could see far further into the future than anyone else. And that just ain't true. I mean, sometimes these were just people who worked a bit harder. They put in more hours or they did more experiments. They weren't particularly brilliant. They just were prepared to be open-minded, to fail often and fast and learn from failure, all these kind of things.